And also too, I want to say thanks for coming and attending, and also best wishes to Rich. Hope that he feels better as well there. I'm going to attempt my share screen technology. It's saying that it host disabled attendee
Oh.
screen sharing.
Okay, hold on. Let me just put just a host.
So this will just take just one quick second, and we can delve into some of this.
You should be a co-host now, yeah.
Okay, I'm good now. Yep. I got the power. All right. Just sort of want to start out with this, getting into this sort of theme of the trick mirror and some of these questions around identity, authenticity, myth, and cultural appropriation. And I sort of zeroed in on 1619 to sort of get at and investigate some of these questions. And I guess sort of my starting point is I'll show these two images here. And they're two depictions of this sort of moment of 1619, right? And this is the first one, and then this is the second one. I'll try to switch back between them a little bit so you can at least get a feel for somewhat what they are. We obviously can go back to those too. So let me just read a bit of the provenance on these, so you just get a feel for what they are, right? So now this one, well, let me ask, which one feels most authentic to you, right? And then I'll sort of comment with this. This one was made circa 1642, 1640s, not exactly sure on the date. And you'll hear why that is in a moment here. The figures that dominate the foreground and the middle ground appeared in several engravings depicting various parts of the New World. They're showing up in views of Barbados. They're showing up, as you see there, in New Amsterdam. So there are a couple versions. This is maybe the version, these stock images of the slaves carrying, this stock image of the Quaker and the tobacco farmer, sort of being used to portray the New World as vibrant and full of energy and these things, right? So that one maybe lends more question perhaps than this one. And this one made 1954, but by Sidney King, who made it a point to spend a significant amount of time at the Jamestown site. He enlisted a group of architects, archaeologists, and historians in an effort to authenticate his sketches, right? He spent long hours in the libraries and other things, trying to sort of unpack and make sense of this moment. And it just gives you some interesting sort of thoughts to sort of consider about how these moments are being depicted, right? How this world is being depicted. And I think certainly the facet of the trick mirror sort of figures into this, right? So if we just sort of take a look at the issue of authenticity and identity, right? How are we even remembering who or how or who we are essentially, right? Historically, not necessarily white. Englishman, Dutchman, Christian, also too on the African side, more naming of place, Angolan, Fanti, or those who maybe are living in Europe or in Blackamoor, other term, Negar, Negro, Black, right? All these sorts of terminologies. Think about the attempt to try to make sense of these moments, this history, amid the sort of trigger warnings and the dog whistles of this sort of contemporary moment, right? It just adds to the challenge of that. Even if you broaden out the question of identity and authenticity, to even sort of maybe even include movements themselves, right? What's the identity of the current social movement, right? How much does it draw upon the civil rights and experiences of the past? What sort of frame of leadership is at work in that context? These are all the range of sorts of questions that come out. And I think looking at Pezekar and then at John Quincy Adams and at Thomas Ball's images of the varying remembrances, the ways we are remembering the end of slavery gets at some of this sort of very question around identity and authenticity, right? And then on the myth side, myth is doing some strange kinds of things here, right? Particularly in the context of sort of making sense of a 1619, right? Well, how are the folks of African descent sort of understood, right? Or how does myth figure into making these people slaves or captives or racial others, right? The facets of invisibility, the idea of Africans having really no history of their own, right? The characterizations of barbarism, brutality, and enslavement, the equating of religion to fetish, right? On and on. Even, the very idea of white supremacy itself, although a myth, the sort of impact of this as a myth, right? And all this myth making, for me, getting at something that says, is the only thing that makes for an African American or a diasporic, an Afro-Atlantic identity, something that's only the trauma. Is that the only sort of intersector? And if we can always make the case that there are all these sort of cultural antecedents and other forms of attachment, where are they in the sort of real, sort of more mainstream grappling with it, making sense of African-American history? So then the point that Trulio makes there is just very, very relevant. The experience of African-Americans outside of the United States challenges the direct correlation between past traumas and historical relevance. In other words, making sense of oneself somewhat outside of the experiences of slavery. And even that in itself taking on some sort of mythical proportions, right? Think about the ways in which people of the diaspora would be invited to sort of make sense of their experience, particularly that African connection, right? Myth is going to play a pivotal role in some of that. So there's myth again, right? Think about some of the sort of ideations of people, I've quoted Gates many times in the context of this, right? And his sort of reminding of all of the things that people from the Middle Passage will bring with them, right? Everything from language to their stories, their music, which functions as a mnemonic device, metaphysical systems of order, all these kinds of things, right? The idea of the trickster topos itself, a generalizing sort of mythical character that sort of can one that can sort of make connections with people of varying ranges of the diaspora. So folks from West Central Africa, folks maybe from the Akan or the Gold Coast or West Africa, folks from other regions can make connections via this sort of myth. So in that sense, maybe we see myth sort of functioning in a couple of ways. But those factors, identity, myth, and then we'll sort of deal with cultural appropriation. But I thought first it would be relevant just to turn now in that context to some of what's actually happening in this sort of real historical or perceived historical space, I guess we can call it, right? So what is happening? I mean, what is 1619 really about? What's actually happening in those moments there? At least in terms of if we're drawing more on the historical record, perhaps, and less on the politics of 1619. What are we pulling out, right? What's coming from that, right? Well, about the colony being established in 1607. We know about Powhatan and the Algonquin and his own sort of efforts to expand amidst increasing chaos and friction with other groups such as the Iroquois and others, right? And then the arrival of the English in Powhatan in a place of essentially sort of starving the young colony, the young fledgling Jamestown colony, when they sort of tried to steal food, literally, in an effort to sort of survive. I mean, so there's your Jamestown, right? And then you come into this place where head rights is folks who are able to bring in people and hire them and use them and put them to work and use them on land, they get land, right? So again, you got something very interesting at work there. You got all the poor landless indentured servants who come from Europe in large numbers. There's all sorts of stories of those folks being duped into travel. Some people, they would catch them at the docks, and if they had drinking or become too inebriated, they would wake up the next morning 30 or 40 miles out. These kinds of things, but this real desire for folks to come as indentured servants, right? And even pressure for the Native Americans themselves to send laborers. We've got to find a task, but of course, what is that task, right? Well, it's the growing of tobacco, Orinoco, right? And they tried a range of other things first before this one became the one. But this Orinoco tobacco becomes the one, developed in Spain, and obtained either from Trinidad or Bermuda, not exactly sure there, but it grew and it had the same sort of the flavor that people liked, that compared favorably with Spanish tobacco. So as you can see there in the top right there, James's counterblast in 1604 condemning that very tobacco, but the very namesake of his colony will grow because of that very tobacco, right? And you see the sort of impact of its growth. just in, of course, by 1616 up to 1639, and by 1775 up to 100 million, right? And of course, those pounds of tobacco playing a pivotal role in underwriting English expansion into the slave trade, right? So much so that it's having the sort of Atlantic impact, in the sense that folks as far as the Sudanic states, Timbuktu, a Muslim by the name of Sekou Amadou says, yeah, there's a growing appetite for this. They're trading for about 6 or 7 rolls of sweetened tobacco. Each roll, about 75 pounds, is about the price that you could pay for a slave. So they get you some idea of its value and how it will help to grow. But in Jamestown, what does it do, right? Well, as the colony expands based on the tobacco production, more and more the Algonquin folks begin to decline. Right, so much so that by 1622, you have something called the Jamestown Massacre. Some folks have called it, but essentially Powhatan's uprising, where he nearly destroys Jamestown. Right, the last of it. So you're saying, well, what is this? Now you don't hear any. Do you hear some of this story? And if you look at the New York Times sort of items and go through some of the new language around how to teach this as pedagogy and these things, is this part of that, right? I mean, maybe that's the question that we're getting at. And then so maybe this is where we sort of turn into some of that, right? You got folks coming from Africa, and there's a tension in Africa going on between a number of groups over the very issue of enslaving people, right? And members and representatives of the Holy Roman, the Catholic Church are there. And in part to sort of pursue efforts to convert the local leaders to Christianity or to Catholicism. So all of this is going on. There's all sorts of tension and friction that begins to erupt in the context of this. So we can imagine the Civil War that begins to expand out in this sort of space, right? And in that space, you have Angela, a Luanda and Ngongo woman who is actually baptized in Africa and then ends up captive aboard a frigate called the San João Batista, right? Somewhere along the route, 2 ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer, occupied by a Dutch and English captain, respectively, who are running under different marquees, as you can see there. The Treasurer runs under an Italian marquee, right? They come upon the Batista, and they've been in the mode of capturing ships. So they come upon the Batista, they take the slaves from the Spanish, take 50 or 60 of them, the remaining they send to Veracruz, right? And then this is where the White Lion ends up in Jamestown with captives brought to the Virginia colony, 20 and odd Negroes aboard a Dutch man of war who were purchased because the colony needed, the colony had food and they wanted to labor, so they were able to make that exchange. And then Angela actually will come just a little bit later after these 20 or so others who will make this trip, right? But what starts to emerge there is a very, very sort of interesting dynamic. 30% of the population that are Black, that are living on the Eastern Shore here in the Chesapeake Bay area, are free Black people, right? And the very idea of their presence subverted the logic of slavery in the eyes of free Black and white alike, right? And it's a transactional model. It's not necessarily identity that's sort of featured in the way these folks are coming to and making a case for their free identity, right? As late as 1677, you have a John Johnson, a 3rd generation free Black, who purchases a tract of land called Angola, right? And this in itself gets at and hints at the sort of, we've got a free society here that's quite significant, right? And one of the sort of features of this, or how it goes, either towards enslavery or towards obtaining more rights of liberty, is sort of centered around the African women. They become very central in what is going to become, by the time you get to 1677, a real sort of breakdown in a system which had allowed for free Blacks to sort of exist, essentially. And what you saw maybe in hindsight was a path to modernity that avoided the enormity of slavery and its contemporary legacy, right? So we're talking about really the founder of this. By the time John Johnson has bought the land in 1677, a lot has happened, right? And the first Johnson, who is called the patriarch of Punguti Creek, right? In 1645, he writes that he has divided his corn, and I'm very glad for it now that I know mine own ground, and will I work when I please and play when I please. Now think about that, right? We're talking about 1619 as perhaps a concreted system of slavery in place, but you can see in 1645, this man owns his own land, right? And yeah, maybe perhaps you want to call him an anomaly, right? He comes aboard as Antonio the Negro on a ship called the James, you know, and he's a captive, right? Despite an indenture. So there's some interesting things going on, because also what you sort of see is that slavery and indentured servitude are working hand in hand. They're together, and there's some fluidity between them, right? So at any rate, we remember that in 1622, Powhatan will destroy or try to destroy Jamestown, right? And when that happens, many of the survivors, they're fledgling at those moments, right? And at that point, Anthony and his wife buy 250 acres of land, right, of their own, right? And it tells us something. It's quite revealing about the sort of impact of this. And I think I switched those slides around there, but you could see that they were representative of this sort of percentage of the population that were free, that had some asserted authority, and were able to sort of counter the notion that we will use, that oftentimes is referenced in the 1619 document published by the New York Times Magazine, that this is the start of slavery. But we see how maybe something else might, at least is worth sort of considering in the context of this, right? And other things will be at play here for sure, right? I mean, and look at what else sort of plays out. The John Punch and the John Castor figure also tell us and are quite revealing about what's going on in this world as well, right? John Punch gets involved in a little bit of a case. He's engaged in some theft. They steal some items, and it's he and Victor Dutchman and a Scotsman by the name of James Gregory, who in the light of that crime try to run away. They get caught and they all get whipped. Now, all three of the men get 4 years added to their indenture, but Punch, who happens to be of African descent, is sentenced to lifetime servitude. So now you start to see some of the sort of beginnings of things. And this is also, you got to remember, this is happening at the same time, 1645, Anthony Johnson is saying, my own ground, right? So you could see where this is in this space. And even the Johnsons themselves own people, right? They have their own indentured servants and folks who they're calling captive. They're old planters. They're called they were ancient livers there, right? They lived there for many, remember back as some of the earliest settlers there, right? So they had that strong connection there, right? And first they let their slave Castor, who have been made their quote unquote Negro for life, they let him go. And in 1655, they re-enslave him. So this kind of thing, right? And the fact that, of course, they will own a very significant amount of land. And ultimately, in 1660, they moved to Maryland. And Anthony dies, and the wife continues on and maintains this land, right? But as I mentioned before, the sort of space in the African women sort of begin to shape this further and further. And at least these first two pieces of legislation hint at it. In 1671, it's sort of declared that children got by an English man upon a Negro woman shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother. And if any Christian shall commit fortification with a Negro man or woman, he shall pay double the fines of the former act. That's 1661, 1667, where some doubts have arisen whether children are by birth, should by virtue of their baptism be made free. It is enacted that baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. So you can start to see those teeth starting to sink in a little bit, right? And then by 1670, the land that had been purchased, right, is up. There's tension over this land and what's going to happen to it, right? And since Johnson's a Negro and by consequence an alien, it is in those moments that the land is then reverted back to the crown. But again, you have something very interesting here at work, perhaps, right? At least one that invites us to maybe look beyond maybe what the sort of online perception of 1619 seems to be. And a lot of things come out. And I would just point to the quotes by one, Lerone Bennett, the very famous editor of Ebony and Jet magazine, who says Black servants and white women, servants and aristocracy ran away together, played together, revolted together, mated and married. And he's talking about this very period that we're describing. Then, of course, there's Berlin, who also reminds that Atlantic Creoles blurred racial lines in early colonial Chesapeake and beyond. Something else is at work here that makes 1619 a significant starting point, right? One that we want to sort of consider. And then I think that leads us to sort of maybe where we at least we can end, and hopefully open the floor for some questions and some dialogue, is about this sort of issue of cultural appropriation. And I'm wrestling with it because, you know, you get into this sort of notion of it as theft, and I think so, right? I mean, for instance, in terms of commodification of resources, humanity, culture, right? These kinds of things, right? And maybe this just sort of very, very base example of sort of cultural appropriation, right? When Benin City is sacked in 1897, a lot of the materials are taken and they become part of private collections. Ultimately, in the 1950s, Walt Disney buys a collection from the Tishman, and it becomes a Walt Disney Tishman collection, right? And which becomes this massive collection of African art, right? So I don't know, where's cultural appropriation? How do we start making sense of that in the context of maybe Disney's possession of these items, right? Or the sharing of these items, because they are in the Smithsonian, right? Or then in another lens of cultural appropriation, right? If we go back to Benin City and its sacking in 1897 and other prior attempts by the English to sort of take over the region, right? Amid the slave trade as well, some folks who leave the region there, Benin City, the main city, Abuakuta, right? Leave the place, right? They're brought as captives. They're brought to Jamaica. They end up settling in Westmoreland in Jamaica. And what's the name that they give to the place where they find much comfort, which is today part of a garden heritage center, right? Abuakuta, right? As sort of a reference to a memory of home. So what does that say? Are they appropriating culture too? Because some of those folks are not necessarily from Abuakuta. Some of them become facets of this identity. So where do we sort of make sense of them, right? I think that's the question we're left with. And similarly, 1619 brings up these sort of memories of authority. I mean, it's a place of authority. People in today's contemporary space can draw on 1619 for the authority, for the existence, for the resistance, perhaps. But I mean, even that too, I think is a sort of form of cultural appropriation, right? And it's something I think that's sort of a sort of ritual process of all. And so I think, I'm not sure. I mean, it means that there's something we have to think about this in a bit of a different way. And I guess for me, there are a couple sort of things that I think are worth considering, or at least perhaps a quote that I think I would like to end with that I think sort of hits at the sort of the relevance of this, right? The first one is Kwame Appiah. And he says, if there is any lesson in the broad shape of the circulation of cultures, it is surely that we are all contaminated by each other, that there is no longer a freely autochthonous African culture awaiting savage by our artists, just as there is, of course, no American culture without African roots. The postulation of a unitary Africa over and against a monolith West, the binarism of the self and the other, is the last of the shibboleths of the modernizers that we must learn to live without. And that's Kwame Appiah. And if I could just throw one more quote in there and then I'll end, which is just, of course, Frantz Fanon. He says, Negroes or white and tension between the consciousness birth negritudes, a dialectical term and a phase of history, its destruction and transition, a means and not an ultimate end. These torchbearers of history ignited the flame of a torch that was already there waiting for that term of history. So that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Robert. Yeah, there's a lot of productive stuff to talk about there, and I'm looking forward to kind of picking back up on it. I kind of reworked this a few times And so I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that I think you just talked about with the with cultural appropriation. It is hard to follow both you and Franz Fanon, but I'm going to do my best. So can you, am I sharing now? Okay. Well, so the object that that I kind of began with in thinking about cultural appropriation was the video. Sorry, is the song "Natural Blues" by Moby. It's on his 1999 album Play, and you may not recall that album, so I will play you just like a couple of seconds of it. Here's the video. There you go. And to recall this. So that should kind of jog your memory, and you can listen to the whole thing. What you'll hear is basically some electronic dance music played over and around almost the entirety of a 1937 song, "Trouble So Hard," by the Alabama folk singer Vera Hall. And you can kind of hear, this is the original recording of it. So the point here with this particular song, if we're talking about cultural appropriation, is that it's basically the entirety of the song is played over this. And I don't really care about Moby or his album, but I think it's a fitting pivot between the way media and cultural politics worked in the late 20th century and the way they work today. Moby's album in 1999 sits at the intersection of this sort of moment between the way media and cultural politics worked. At this moment, when culture production remained completely in the hands of a largely white capitalist legacy media, and then the moment we live today, where everyday people are able to challenge this dominant culture, not only for its appropriation of subaltern cultures, but indeed for the entire system that maintains this hierarchy of dominant and marginalized. Though it's only part of the story I'm trying to tell here, it helps to begin by thinking in terms of the transition from property or intellectual property, the subject of my last book, to propriety. Similar to what you were just talking about, Robert, in terms of the difference between a transactional model as opposed to an identity model. To this, I could add that it wasn't so much the identity at this point. When I think about propriety, it's the relationship between different subjects who exist on different sides of this hierarchy of differences and identities. And you know, this is the hierarchy that emergent debates over cultural appropriation, over Black Lives Matter, of Time's Up, that these movements threaten to upend. Kimbrough, to kind of go back to this moment right before Moby, that Kimbrough, MacLeod, and Peter DeCola estimate that the cost of licensing the samples used in some of the most path-breaking early records of the genre of hip-hop, Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet, and Beastie Boys' Paul Boutique, they conclude that if those artists had been forced to pay the current existing licensing fees for the samples they included, quote, it would no longer be viable to release these two albums today, end quote. And basically they just say that it would cost them more per album. They would have to pay, they would actually have to pay to release it. They would lose money on the albums for the samples that they used. In contrast, Moby was dutiful about his clearance of copyright. He made sure to get permission to use Vera Hall's song, originally recorded by the folk music collector Alan Lomax for Atlantic Records. He not only licensed the samples he used, but he managed to license almost every song on the album that he created for use in a commercial or a film. So I would still, though, argue that the song, and perhaps the album as a whole, which features several other archival recordings of African Americans, also drawn from the same Atlantic Records folk music anthology, would no longer be viable to release today, or at least it would have raised a great deal of controversy, particularly as a textbook case of what would now likely be decried as cultural appropriation. I think We're all familiar with this discourse, this concept, such that it's become a familiar feature of not only our social media landscape, but of the wider legacy media as well, such as Adele's recent appropriation of Bantu knots and a Jamaican flag bikini for the Notting Hill Carnival, a story which was picked up by English language news sites around the world. Or more relevantly, take the controversy that erupted over Bruno Mars after his Grammy win for the song 24 Karat Magic. In a video for The Grapevine, writer and activist and cultural critic Cern Sensei said that, quote, Bruno Mars is 100% a cultural appropriator. He is not Black at all, and he plays up his racial ambiguity to cross genres. This led to weeks of controversy, which was only mostly settled when Stevie Wonder declared it to be bullshit. But this emergent conversation about appropriation needs to be placed in the history of white appropriations of Black music, and especially what Margot Jefferson calls the ripping off of Black music in her essay in Harper's in 1973. In this essay, she barely mentions copyright, and when she does, it's in the context of the 19th century. Instead, she traces what she calls, quote, the great chain of minstrelsy, end quote, from T.D. Rice to Elvis. And we could draw it further still. Indeed, the critique of Bruno Mars, made by activist and writer Cern Sensei, was that he's popular because he performs Black music, but he appears white to most Americans. Speaking of a similar dynamic at play when white musicians like Elvis perform the songs and styles of Black musicians, Jefferson says, quote, the performer's white skin, like an actor's curtain call, is an ingenious safety device, signaling that the show is over and nothing has changed, end quote. Jefferson has much to say about the larger processes of cultural appropriation and the ways the folk revival, largely driven by well-meaning but segregated white people, fits into the history of US rock and roll. But she primarily lays the blame at the marginal status of Black people and Black culture in a white supremacist capitalist entertainment industry, which catered to white audiences first and relied upon successful white musicians like the Rolling Stones to identify, quote, which Black performers to listen to, end quote. Her complaint, therefore, is stated more in the language of shame. Shame, as Jennifer Jacquet points out in her book, Is Shame Necessary?, can be a powerful tool when used sparingly. But it is also a tool associated with those who do not have the full power of the state, which can be used for more forceful punishments. But as Jacquet states, quote, shame is calibrated to social norms. And so part of the work that Jefferson is doing is to argue for a new norm, a new set of shared values. By the end of the 1970s, these dynamics were partially upended by the technologies of mixing turntables, cassette tapes, and the club scene of major American cities like New York. These changes, their politics, and the larger context of neoliberalism are well chronicled by scholars like Tricia Rose in her book Black Noise. The rise of sampling in early hip-hop records turned this legacy of illegitimate appropriation on its head. In response to this more democratic, counter-hegemonic, transcultural production, the predominantly white music business shifted quickly to the juridical tools and ideological commonplaces of the emergent neoliberal capitalist orders. They sued for copyright infringement. In short, when predominantly Black performers and DJs began working in the Black-coded genres of rap and hip-hop, the dominant culture responded not with the tool of shame per se, but with the shame associated with breaking a natural law. When the Supreme Court was asked to judge whether Biz Markie should have gotten clearance for his use of Gilbert Sullivan's song Alone Again Naturally, they ruled, quote, the conduct of the defendants herein violates not only the Seventh Amendment, but also the copyright laws of this country. Sort of staging this as some sort of they're breaking the laws of God by stealing a song. It was improper, but more important, it could be declared illegal according to the property laws, enforced by courts, lawyers, judgments, and fines. In an era where property was ruled by a disembedded understanding of property, propriety was ruled by a disembedded understanding of property, Moby ticked off all the boxes in completing his licensing forms. He paid the royalty checks and even went above and beyond and licensed every other song. By the dominant logic of property, he was a model subject. But I think in spite of this, if not because of it, his album would have been received very differently in terms of the propriety of his appropriations. The problem with Moby is not that he appropriated from a culture that's not his own. It's that he appears to do so with no feeling, no understanding, no attempt at actually incorporating the music and feelings of Vera Hall, her song, or the subjectivity it laments. As he discusses the process of composing this album in his autobiography, his concern is to show his proficiency in music theory, to prove that the white dominant audience, that his craft is indeed an art. But in his account of the process through which he abstracts the sounds to compose his songs, he shows this to be an emotionally detached appropriation, uncurious about the origins of the fetish that delights him, and uninterested in developing a longer-term relationship with its producers, except those related to contracts and intellectual property. This logic remains important, if not dominant, with different musicians vying for credited authorship on major recording label releases, such as the recent dust-up over Lizzo's chart-topping song, Truth Hurts. And surely the conversation about propriety has been present throughout. But emergent social media platforms allow critics to voice the kind of concerns Jefferson was raising in the 1970s, even as it allows producers to more frequently circulate suspect cultural artifacts to critique. Thus, I use the term propriety here because it is a tool that critics like Jefferson used to not only critique what they saw as illegitimate cultural appropriations, but to define what a legitimate cultural appropriation would be. Roughly, Black musicians should get credit and get paid for the music that they create. But this in turn opens up a whole new set of questions. Oh, and I see that the slide's already advanced, sorry. A whole new set of questions, such as how to define authenticity in music or culture, how that authenticity is to be determined by socially constructed categories like race. And here, it's worth kind of looking at these original recording of Vera Hall was made by Alan Lomax, who had originally met Hall in the 1930s when traveling through the US South with his father, using a massive 300-pound acetate disc recorder in the trunk of their Ford sedan. They aimed to make a record of folk songs and music in the United States. While they did this on a grant from the Library of Congress, it was roughly at the same moment, as Michael Denning recounts in his book, The Noise Uprising, that nascent record companies were sending recorders to major port cities around the globe to capture the authentic and unusual musics of the world in order to sell them. Denning sees the record companies as unwitting accomplices of what he calls, quote, a world musical revolution, crediting their appropriation and redistribution of this culture with spreading the revolutionary ideas and critiques of colonial repression, such that this corporate exploitation of global music could be credited with educating the anti-colonial movement worldwide. The Lomaxes were responsible for discovering the music of some of the most important voices in American music, such as Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Leadbelly. Perhaps in this vein, their recording of Vera Hall has something of the authentic in it. But the audio politics of their recording process are not so straightforward. For instance, the Lomaxes originally found and recorded Leadbelly in a Texas prison in the 1930s. This was not accidental. John Lomax believed that the best place to find authentic Black music was to concentrate on visiting inmates in Southern prisons. The rationale being that their performance of Black music and culture would be more authentic because it had been untouched by the musical miscegenation of the outside world. But as Hugh Barker and Yuval Taylor put it, all in all, Southern music was a hybrid, a product of musical miscegenation. The division of white hillbilly and Black blues music was an act of segregation most likely imposed by Northern record companies with an eye to the future of market segmentation. Of Alan Lomax, Yuval Taylor and Hugh Barker say, quote, he was an idealist. He believed that American Blacks still comprised a culturally homogenous group, despite evidence that their music had undergone countless transformations through relentless mixing with that of whites. In short, culture is appropriation. And this is something that we, on a kind of everyday level, we can appreciate. I feel like this recent act of appropriation, where gay men appropriated the hashtag Proud Boys on Twitter. This is an appropriation that we can appreciate, right? Even though it is clearly, one culture taking from another, at least that's exactly what the point of the appropriation is, right? The authenticity of culture, though, particularly when we try to trace its origins in the history of a social construction like race, is definitely a sort of myth. On the other hand, I would argue that there's something very important about the fact that major white recording artists now have to concern themselves with this question, to address the criticism made by internet activists and be prepared to defend their relationship with the communities and traditions that they mean to meld in their music. This, I would argue, fits into a larger transformation underway, which is the overarching subject of a book I'm working on. And as a conclusion here, I'd like to highlight some of this kind of larger context. The title of this sort of project is called Triggered, and it is kind of stepping off or jumping off from some of these arguments. That the term triggered and the concept of trigger warnings are one of many hashtags that serve as emergent sites of struggle, particularly between what is called the left and the right, but also among the myriad of groups that comprise them. And this study would also consider these movements in relation to Black Lives Matter, to Time's Up, and to concepts like cultural appropriation and safe spaces. But it frames this discussion in a kind of broader struggle, which I would argue is best understood over the fight over whose safety the dominant culture prioritizes, whose propriety the dominant culture considers sort of legitimate, whose trauma it recognizes, and whose triggers it tries to avoid. And while there's little agreement on what the terms of this settlement should be, there are moments of agreement among the several fronts in this war. At the center, I argue, is the concept of safety: who's responsible for securing it, who's allowed to feel it, where and how. And in the shorthand I'll develop further in this sort of book project I'm currently working on, we're experiencing this as a crisis in what I'm calling hegemonic safe space. Hegemonic safe space captures the emotional and affective dimensions of the very political and social fact that a straight, white, cisgendered man like myself is not only especially insulated from the everyday triggers and traumas of this society, but that insulation effectively relies upon the unearned deference of those who occupy non-preferred categories of subjectivity. So that insofar as I feel disproportionately safe, it's because others have internalized a culture-wide trigger warning. My feeling of safety, therefore, comes not only at the cost of those who occupy those non-preferred categories, it's a product of their active, affective labors of deference. As women, anti-racist, people of color, LGBTQ activists, and many others have expanded and renewed their centuries-long struggle to challenge this status quo, they're not only challenging it politically, but refusing to do the emotional labor that has hereafter been part of the unpaid work they perform for that hegemonic system. Thus, these movements are not just about identity politics. The discussion of cultural appropriation is not just about cultural appropriation. It's about something larger. It's a struggle over subjectivity, a struggle over whose subjectivity is allowed to sort of feel safe. We are familiar with the language of practices and ambiguities of subjectivity because we're bombarded with them every day. Magazines tell women how to please men, assuming that this is a question easily answered and of concern to all persons identifying as women. News segments position people of color as paradoxically lazy and dangerous, cautioning the implicitly white viewer to beware of their interactions with these others. Stores provide gender-specific clothes and toys, suggesting how girls and boys should dress and when they should play, and therefore what they should expect, what they should enjoy. Even with these supposed gains in civil rights and women's rights, gay rights, and trans rights, the hegemonic culture continues to define who should be deferential to who should have power and interaction, who should have to ask for permission, who should be able to use community resources like we're talking about in terms of culture. Privilege may be an insufficient concept for discussing this, but it gets at something true. It's not just about who has the money in the bank or the job, has money in the bank, who is able to get jobs or education, or who is the preferred candidate for public office. It's about who feels safe to walk down the sidewalk, to swim at the public pool, or to use those community resources without express permission. In this sense, subjectivity is not just about ideology interpolating subjects. It's also about the feeling of security that comes from being a preferred subject, and the feeling of fear and risk that comes from moving through the world as a subject whose very existence is marked as a problem. Staying safe as a woman, as a person of color, as a gay or transsexual person requires, in many cases, reshaping the way you act, or feeling that you have to at least navigate those triggers to prevent triggering what could eventually be a violent reaction from the preferred subjects of the hegemonic culture. Though they can't be comprehensively delineated and changed dramatically depending on the context, the triggers of this hegemonic culture are infused not only in the culture, but in our laws and institutions. In both colloquial warnings and court cases, women are told that their choice of clothing, their path home at night, their insolence in the face of male authority may trigger a rape or assault. The parents of Black children, especially Black boys, must coach their kids lest they inadvertently trigger the police officers charged with their protection, not to mention the white supremacist terrorists who have killed with near impunity for over 2 centuries. To paraphrase Roland Barthes, why not ask the parents of Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, and Tamir Rice what they think of trigger warnings in safe spaces? This book is therefore not really about trigger warnings, but about concepts like trigger warnings, safe spaces, cultural appropriation, movements such as Time's Up, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and their origins in counter-hegemonic movements, their development and spread through emergent media, and their limits in terms of a comprehensive and lasting change to the hegemonic order. And in this context, therefore, I think the conversation about cultural appropriation is absolutely essential, and I'm glad that there are activists able to carry on this conversation. But I'd also caution activists from reifying, and I think this is in some ways what you're also pointing to, Robert, and what your kind of history here helps us to kind of think about in a longer trajectory. Reifying categories of subjectivity through which we are forced to live. Instead, we should all be trying to kind of dismantle that structure that allows those categories to exist, pushing against the binaries that have long divided us and in some ways defined us, and working toward that kind of equitable space of safety and safety for all. So I'll stop there because I think that's close to my 20 minutes. And now we have plenty of time for discussion, questions, and I have some things that I would also talk to you about, Robert, because there are definitely some interesting
Okay. Yeah, I think
connections.
likewise. Yeah, I think likewise. So,
well, I don't know if I don't know. Are we just, Oscar? What's the process for?
So for the Q&A, people, if they could start jumping in, but if people like, they could also raise their hand or put it in the chat box. And if you put it in the chat box, then I could just read the question out of there.
Okay, great. Well,
question away. Well, should I ask a question while we're waiting or no?
Go ahead.
Sure. If you didn't, I was going to. So you go.
Because Sean, I just thought it was just super interesting. Even now, we talked about these topics and we had flushed it out prior. And then as we both did them separately and now came on, I'm like, I mean, we still ended up in a very sort of interesting sort of space, because I really liked how you were talking about dismantling these kinds of binaries and the need to really do that. And I guess, and also too, I mean, I guess I studied the past, and you very much are in a very real contemporary space. I mean, you know, Moby, man, all the dope artists, bro. I mean,
Moby is not exactly contemporary.
Exactly. Right. You got my sarcasm there. But I thought, like, what do you think about like Black Lives Matter, like leadership and some of these other forms of leadership in terms of how they are addressing the sort of so I mean, if you would think about how you would have a civil rights leader in the past, there's always a sort of main figure, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, someone who you could sort of, people would draw around in this space, and for the right kinds of reasons. People have sort of said, well, a leader potentially is at risk of violence, as you described. So, and then, so people have sort of said, well, let's do something where it's less about the leader and more about the movement. So I just wondered, in light of things, maybe if you had some thoughts about that, I was interested.
There's a lot there, man.
Yeah.
I mean, I think to pick up on one thing you said, I mean, I think that one argument for not having a leader is that there's those leaders are especially targeted. Right. I mean, this is we're still finding out what the FBI was saying to Martin Luther King in the back channel. Yes. We're still finding out about what kinds of plans they were making and what kinds of work they were doing to try to take him down because he was influential. I'm sure that if the evidence isn't already out there, then we'll find it of Malcolm X, and certainly we have it of the Black, around the Black Panthers. I mean, so that's not an unwise position to take, that having a leader that's very visible makes it a fragile movement. So I think that there are locuses of that movement, right? I mean, so the Black Youth Project 100 here in Chicago, I mean, they do all kinds of work in terms of like presenting policy proposals and white papers and stuff like that I think so there are ideas about or there are I guess forms of leadership. So, but if I don't know, I think that it's also just kind of like the form that many movements are taking right now, right? I mean, this is how movements kind of catch on. So it wasn't, I mean, it's interesting to kind of see Black Lives Matter as one of the sort of forerunners of all these movements. If you kind of jump all the way back to Trayvon, which is where they started. And I mean, there's no way they could have known that it would have kept going in quite the same way. But that also was the result of many other activists and a lot of organizing. And I kind of look forward to the history. I hope they're keeping good archives, because there's some really interesting history that could be done on what kind of organizing has happened between those two that timeline. How did Black Lives Matter catch on? What kind of really deliberate work was being done to kind of make that movement catch on in a kind of leaderless way?
Yes.
Like there's an amazing story there that is, I would say, unprecedented in history, or at least in maybe in the history before the 20th century.
Right. I mean, yeah. No.
So we have a question, Mimi Yang.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you, Oscar. I probably to start my, Oscar, what do you think? I have a question for each, for Robert and Sean. Do you want to ask them separately or at once?
You could ask them separately or at once, whichever you prefer.
All right. The first question goes to Robert. Talking about the Middle Passage, right? And when the slave, shipped, actually, when it came to U.S., Virginia, or Charleston, they had to go through the Caribbean. So, which means the entire slave trade, Atlantic slave trade, there was a collaboration or cooperation between Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, then finally American, hands, right? There's a like a global organization doing that. So the question is basically, is there's a color line because of a slave trade? You have different races coming into contact. So the color line, both Frederick Douglass and W.D. Du Bois in their, extensively talk about, and they even prophesized that in the U.S., the nation can never surpass, never cross this color line will be our national tragedy, right? So the way I see it, Black Lives Matter, and I'm still seeing these ships, ghost ships, still sailing towards these shores. You know, because the color line is still among us. So it's very disturbing. When you can talk, you can talk about the imagery, iconic icons of slavery and everything. Even you remove everything, but in the deep psyche of this nation, the wounds still there. Now it's being reopened, restarted to bleed. Right, whenever there's a transformative moment, it happens. So basically, you can focus on colonial era, you can focus on Civil War, Reconstruction, you can focus on the contemporary civil rights movement in our time, but you cannot avoid this color line. So Robert, the thing is it true? Do you believe we can never overcome this color line, even in the 21st century? Because I'm still seeing the ships sailing towards us.
Wow. Wow, I just think, that's a powerful question. I'm very well put, and a critical one about the sort of the continuation of a color line. And I do think there are some things in there that are very much inevitable, but there are some things that are not, some of it is thinking about going back to, the slave trade itself, I mean, one of the things you mentioned was that, most of the ships made their way to the Caribbean, and the majority did. But you have to remember, some came directly to America, a small percentage, right? But you do have enough of that, maybe about 500,000, that makes a case for something unique in terms of Africans coming directly from Africa and coming to North America. So there's that, and then I think again, part of the problem with white supremacy for me is that we can put, we think of how can I say this? The Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, the Danish, the French, they were tearing holes through each other up and down the coast to control first the gold trade and then the slave trade, right? So there is some collusion with them. Some they do see themselves as European, and these folks as not European, but they're tearing and gnashing at each other to get to that power of that, And then the other thing I always talk about is the gold trade is the first Atlantic trade. It is not people. The gold is the first commodity, right? And so if you just say and just go back and say, if we just look at a start now, very quickly it's going to be people. Let's not get confused. But if we just say for a minute, gold has such a value here, and you have shrewd people on the African side who are negotiating the gold, and you have people who are coming from all over Europe to get at this gold. Something else happens in terms of transaction that maybe has less, at least initially, to do with exploiting humans on a massive scale. So something about that Atlantic context has to be broader than exchange of humanity and human cargo. And some of that is like gold. Some of that is getting into the questions of, Europe's relationship with all this. And for me, as far as a color line, and I know I need to shut up because, I can't stop talking. But as far as a color line, it is, and that's where I think Fanon's so important. And folks like Apia are so important because they're asking us to sort of come back to our hard set fast belief in Du Bois's ideation of a color line. They're asking us to say, maybe, what he was doing there when he was talking about a color line and its sort of impact was also in the same way saying, hey, I want you to not see the color line. Remember, Du Bois, you know who Du Bois's favorite hero, one of his greatest heroes of all time was? Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck. And he had the monocle and everything. He went to Germany and studied at the University of Berlin at a time to study Hegel at a time when a Black person being in is just not there. So you have all that stuff that just sort of says, race is impactful. I tell my students, race is impactful. Don't believe it. It's got its teeth in our experience. But boy, make sure you know you can pull them things out. You can always pull them out. And part of it is just coming to better terms with this experience. And I think that's why I'm a historian, I guess.
Thank you, Robert. And you had a question also for Sean?
Yeah, Sean, one of your slides, Sean, you said culture is appropriation. I can't agree more with that. But then in a melting pot, in American culture, multicultural, multiracial society, the appropriation extends to assimilation, negotiation with different cultures, right? If to appropriate the culture is something offensive, culturally offensive, then how do you explain our mutual assimilation, our the function of this melting pot? Isn't me, you learn my culture, I learn your culture, so we all become American. Is that mutual appropriation? If that is so offensive, let's say, if I started to wear green, pretend to be Irish, maybe Irish people all get offended, and then forever would be separated. You are in that corner, I'm in this corner, right? So that's the thing. So Sean, what is the function of a melting pot? How does that relate to cultural appropriation if it's so offensive?
Well, so I think I would start actually with the example that you just gave of what if you started wearing green and pretended you were Irish?
Yeah.
Well, Irish people don't all wear green, right? So I mean, this is like what you would be doing is not actually appropriating Irish culture, right? You would be appropriating a kind of, you would be like mobilizing a stereotype about Irish people that exists in U.S. culture, right? And that is kind of premised on you not actually understanding, or the person who's doing it. I'll say the hypothetical person who's doing it, not actually understanding Irish culture, not having a relationship to Irish culture, not having a kind of a conversation, and yet kind of trying to perform Irishness and to claim some authentic performance of Irishness simply by wearing green, which I mean is something that actually the dominant culture does once a year, shamelessly. but I think that what I would say is that it's more interesting to probe the offense. It's more interesting to probe that feeling of it being offensive and say, okay, what is actually going on here, right? Why would that be offensive, right? And that, and so what is the actual conversation we're trying to have here when someone says that cultural appropriation is offensive to me? So what is it about the relationship between the two, whether we're talking about a color line? And I think this is an interesting way to kind of frame it, is to say, well, that color line is itself it's a fabrication. It doesn't actually exist. And I didn't know that about Du Bois and von Bismarck, but that's a very interesting kind of fact, right? It's sort of like, well, that's curious. But I mean, so there's this weird way that we have this strange dynamic where, in order to critique this kind of violation, you have to also reify that division, right? And really what it is about power. Like we're really just talking about power, and the power to take without being able to without having to have a conversation, right? Without having to actually know anything about the culture you're taking from. And that's what, when critics of the concept of cultural appropriation say, well, and when I say cultural appropriation, that's a kind of like a fact, right? But they kind of bring up all these excuses. Well, this is just the way it works. There's all these melting pots and that sort of thing. But that's not actually the way it happens, right? It's very much, there are some people who are able to appropriate normally and kind of project, and some people who aren't. And that's the dynamic that I think is worth probing. And it's also the dynamic that many activists who talk about that are turning on their head, right? So I mean, I think the reason I go back to Moby is not because I think but it's a moment when there isn't kind of social media in quite the same way, and so he didn't have to face Twitter, And I think that if he'd had to face Twitter, it would have been a very different reception.
Thank
I don't
you.
know.
So we have a question in the chat box with a comment as well, and then we'll go to Mahurima afterwards. And this one, Sean or Robert, whoever wants to answer the one, it wasn't addressed to anybody, but here it goes. It's from Jennifer Sadler, and it says, colleges and universities seem to come just shy of deconstructing these racist structures. They can articulate that Black Lives Matter, but what does that mean to really impacting faculty, staff, and students? How should higher ed be thinking about anti-racist practices that move us to deconstructing these systems? And it could be either Robert or Sean or both.
I got a thought. I don't know, Sean, do you want to go first or should I?
Well, I'm sure that there's many things that we've done at the college and that we're trying to do. And the only thing I'll just point to is that the college is now launching. So for those of you at Columbia College, it is worth looking at the anti-racist transformation team that's kind of being launched through the DEI committee. And Robert, you're on the DEI committee, so you may have other things to kind of note here. I think that there's always more that can be done, but I do feel like we have a few things that we're doing at this college. But yeah, so that's all I point to. This is something that for those at Columbia College, there's an application process that's just been opened up. There's a lot more information on this site. So
yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm just finished serving for my 2 years on the DI committee, but I would agree. A lot does happen on this campus, and part of it did start with the forming of that group, and people did sort of get into the forefront of pushing conversation, making changes in faculty, making changes in the hiring process, making changes in curriculum, and all these things. So there really are some things going on that I could say that I've directly participated in. But if you want to say to Black Lives Matter specifically, to me, hearing talking about the history of the Black Lives Matter and hearing about some of the perceptions of leadership and the way folks have approached this, this is what I think needs to get out more, because I'm Chicago. I live in Chicago, so my best friend's shop, one of my very good friends' shop, got broken into twice. He's from Senegal. He's a Black, that's all he did was hire folks, Black and African-American folks for jobs to try to get internships. And this place got broken into twice. I know a guy over off 51st, off the expressway. People tore his store up. And then folks would want to equivocate that to Black Lives Matter. And while I know that that's not the case, I think there is a space that the campus can take advantage of to present a space for folks to talk around what Black Lives Matter is. I'm part of this collective impact series, and the thing I want to do is bring members of Black Lives Matter, even Black Youth 100, with the elders, the old heads of Chicago who was involved in the civil rights movement. If there's some that go back to the 60s and the early 50s and 40s, and let them sit and just talk with these folks. Because if there's only challenge, I would say, is just getting this more and more community connective stuff going on. But a lot happens at this college. So.
Thank you. Mahurima?
Hi, thanks both Robert and Sean. That was actually really super interesting. And I'm glad, Sean, that you talked about power, because that's ultimately what my question, I don't know why there's a halo above my head. I guess it's just, that's the way light has ordained me, I guess.
Have you been sainted recently?
Yeah, I was. That was actually going to be my question, was how you felt about my sainthood. But my question actually is about power and how we can resituate power in like the theory around or in theoretical discussions around cultural appropriation. So I was, so if I can split my question a little bit to both of you, Robert, you were talking about Fanon, and the thing that I love about Fanon is how heartbreaking he is, because of course he also said something, I should have just Googled what the quotes were, but he also said something like that the colonial lie has to be like met with, I think, an equal falsehood. And that sentence has always really gotten to me, because you're right that of course he recognizes that Blackness, or the myths around Blackness, are created by colonialism, right? But he also thinks about that as the tool that we can use to fight colonialism. And I came across this quote from Ngugi, who said something like, excuse me, but he said something like like that white people created the Negro as a category, but Black people, created negritude, and I think that there's something about that too, about using the like tools um, of discourse to actually fight. And that's where the distinction lies, is like who's got the power. And I was just thinking about that, about, like that not all binaries are the same, of course, and that this is a discussion that we've been having since at least the negritude movement, about like what it means to upturn a history. And because I was thinking about that from your talk, Robert, and that made me think about Sean, when Sean, you were talking about cultural appropriation. And then of course, both of you in this like synchronous way started talking about authenticity. I don't know, I was wondering if our current anxiety around cultural appropriation isn't just because people or like dominant cultures that have had the chance to be authentic are now being questioned about their authenticity, but that for instance, minority culture and minority cultural products have always had to battle with that question of authenticity, like to what extent, when I talk to my students, I say there's like a way that we think about authenticity, which is like being authentic to our voices and our experience, like our art and our creativity. And then there's the authenticity where we're being authentic to communities, and that Black and brown and people of color artists have always had to struggle with that tension. But now because we're putting it to Adele, now it's like, wait, no, I'm always authentic. But that's, I don't know. So my question, sorry, that was super meandering, but my question is just really, how do we resituate the question of power when we're trying to do this theoretical work?
My first? All right, sure. Yeah, I got another great question. These are great questions. Yeah. Yeah, who is it? Césaire and Senghor. Sorry, I was coming. Who said, why does the tiger express tigritude? You know what I'm saying? So it's right in the spot of that problematic sort of question around negritude. And I like Fanon too, because he leaves you. You're not happy with him coming out telling you everything. In the end, you're still not happy. And he lets you know that. And maybe his life, is suggestive of that in some sad ways, I think maybe. But yeah, I just, and also the other thing I thought that you said was tools of discourse that made the case of the varying sort of nature of the binary, because it is, most people say, you can use the master's tools against the master's house and all of that. And I'm always very skeptical of that phraseology. Not that I completely disagree with it. I just think that maybe saying it's more about, just we're engaged in this process and how are we responding to it, as opposed to this sort of real intentional, this is what he did, so now I'm going to get it and here's what I'm going to do, sort of. I don't know if that makes sense at all. But yeah, those kinds of things. And yeah, I mean, negritude is all around the sort of issue of authenticity, and folks is beginning to sort of wrestle with who they are. I mean, and are you Negro or Black, French, West African, or are you Wolof, or some other background? So those kinds of questions come out. And yeah, I just think it's an ongoing kind of a thing. And I kind of seemed as though you were sort of hinting at maybe one of the challenges with the sort of mainstream society and coming to terms with all these questions of authenticity was like, I don't know. I guess I sort of felt like I thought you were going to say something was missing. And so then folks were trying to fill this void. And I kind of think if you think about what Gia Torres's piece is about, her book, The Trick Mirror piece, she's getting at some of that. Something's missing. And sure, I think there's some cultural facets to it, but something's missing there too, you know. So
yeah, I think that there's there's an essay by Neil Lazarus talking about the nationalism as an idea, and you know, talking about all these critiques of nationalism as a meta narrative. It's kind of like, well, it's just very convenient that these come out right when all of the sort of post-colonial nations are like, they have a nation finally, right? And then suddenly it's like, oh well, nations, it's a terrible idea and no one should have one. You know, and it's all made up and it's an imagined community and all of this. And like, yeah, we know that, but like we didn't have one before. So it's kind of it kind of sucks to say we can't have one. So I mean, I think that I haven't heard that quote from Fanon, but part of me is kind of like, yeah, it's that idea that there is a place for like strategic essentialism, right? That you're sort of like, well, yeah, you said that this there's a line that I'm trying to work in here from the George Michael song Freedom. You know, we got to take these lies and make them true somehow, right? And like figure out a way to kind of make them function in a different way. But I think there's something about your point, Mariam, about that. What I see is really happening in the kind of broader context is that suddenly the dominant culture, yeah, it has to defend itself from many sides about its own authenticity, right? I mean, we have now we've been talking about what we could call like one side. I don't know whether it's necessarily the left, but it's sort of a lefty-ish kind of vein. But then on the other side, there's the president talking about fake news and fake expertise, right? And so this sort of crisis of authenticity in the dominant culture is sort of like coming from all sides, and we're at this sort of pivotal moment, it feels like, in the culture, where we're kind of going to figure out which direction this is going to go and what is going to be authentic. And when we decide what's authentic, that's going to be a lie too, yes, but we want to be in charge of who's making the lie.
So we have time for one last question, and then we will go to closing remarks.
Oh, closing remarks. I should prepare those then.
yeah, me too. Me too.
Anybody has a final question? Okay, I will ask it then.
Yeah.
Basically, the question that I have is, besides cancel culture, what other ways is there to basically make people accountable? For example, there's like this, it was in the news maybe like a month ago. There's this Instagram account called the Quan, and then the owner is basically being accused of digital blackface accusation. So he bought the account from a teenager, and it's basically about memes, and so it's real popular. And when he bought that account, nobody knew that he had bought it from the teenager, and he never changed the black teenager's picture out of the account. So he continued to post in this account, which is very popular when it comes to Instagram. And so like sometimes cancel culture does not work. Like what other ways can we help people accountable?
Well, so this kind of goes back to the question of what is shame good for, and I think that we're learning that it can be a very effective tool, especially if there becomes kind of broad agreement on something being shameful, right? But I mean that's kind of the key though. You have to have a broader culture that agrees that this thing that is happening or agrees on what the definition of what a shameful act is, right? And that's part of what the kind of border cases that you're talking about, where it's kind of like, okay, well, here's the situation. This guy buys an Instagram account. He doesn't change the picture, but that, does he have to? And what, how do we kind of define what's proper here, right? Because if we're talking about the transactional situation, I mean, maybe this is where, that distinction, Robert, that you were making, I don't know how you'd weigh in here, but if it's just about transactions, like he owns that blog, right? And the person sold it to him. So, there's a whole argument that says, well, that's he's paid for it. He's done what he needed to do. But I think that what you're talking about is something broader, which is the idea that there should be a different set of cultural arbiters. And to me, that is, like you're saying, it's not always effective. That unless you can get Twitter or Instagram to sort of change their terms of service to say that you can't impersonate someone of a different race, then there's not like actually a thing that you can do other than just getting more people to troll them, which gives them more traffic, which like we have a system that's perfectly set up for that to be completely ineffective. So I don't know. I mean, I think the alternative is to to be able to set up the dominant culture that says that person just shouldn't get any attention, which is the idea of cancel culture, but it doesn't actually function very well in our culture, because a lot of times what happens is that people then want to go see what's been canceled. It's just too salacious to kind of ignore it. So
thank you, Sean. So if you want to say any final thoughts.
I would just say to that question, Oscar, that I don't know if this is, I don't know. I'm just, we have to be careful, I guess, of the whole thing. I mean, from the coltan and the production of it that, makes all this work, and the way that actual nuts and bolts of the system is created, to me, thinking about, Silicon Valley and the creation of all this and the role they play in all this. And I don't know, those are just some of the things I think we got to be considering too, to some degree, as we think about this. Because I don't know, I mean, maybe it's a bad thing to say. What happens if you tune out? Is that the dangerous devil talk? I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe, but that'll be my final thought, is just being able to measure it out and being able to say when and where maybe you don't want to be on, maybe you do want to be on. I don't know. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, or which topics we want to kind of pick up and really kind of focus on. I mean, is Adele what we want to worry about, or voter suppression? Like that those are the, I mean, we have plenty of other targets right now. And so it does seem like we could, but on the other hand, the fact that anyone's talking about cancel culture or cultural appropriation says something about the democratization of that conversation on a certain level, assuming it's not being run by Russian bots, which I also don't think we can assume, because that's also something that they're playing with.
Yep.
So I think that the other option is since Monterey was in the chat, is to completely overthrow society as it is, to completely create a revolution of all values, and then move towards that utopia. So yeah, she's got
working on the guillotines. Good.
Yeah. I mean, my sense of these in one way is sort of like, it's kind of like the idea of what the proletariat was supposed to do. They're supposed to take power in order to destroy the entire system, right? That you take power of the state, so you get rid of the state. But that, then again, that also relies on a very deeply embedded common culture that you all agree on what needs to happen, which we have yet to get to.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. Any final thoughts you want to leave us both with?
Nope, not for me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it.
I
Well,
did it.
thank
Yeah. Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you, Sean. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we will be basically uploading this to the website, and I'll be sending out an email so the whole campus could see this wonderful presentation from Sean Andrews and Robert Hanser. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks
Thank
a lot,
you.
all. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.